We see them today as silent stones standing against the wind and the rain. The ruins of ancient temples, scattered across the green landscapes of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. They feel peaceful, like places of quiet reflection. But this silence is a lie. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a story that was intentionally erased. Buried beneath these stones are the echoes of rituals so powerful and so dangerous to the worlds that followed, they were declared forbidden. These were not just ceremonies. They were technologies of the soul designed to bend reality. And to understand them, we must first forget the quiet ruins we see and learn to hear the whispers of what was once done there in the dark. To understand the rituals, we must first understand the world they were born from. For the ancient Celts, the world was not a collection of dead things. It was not just rocks, trees, and water. The world itself was alive, and it was watching. Every forest had its own spirit, a consciousness that lived in the rustling of the leaves and the creaking of the branches. Every river was a god or goddess, with its own personality, its own moods, its own demands. To walk through the land was to walk through a crowd of ancient, powerful beings. It was a world of deep beauty, but also of constant, quiet negotiation with forces far older and stronger than humanity. Imagine being a farmer, living in a small village of wood and earth. Your life depends on the sun and the rain, but you do not believe these are mindless forces. The sun is a fiery chariot being pulled across the sky. The rain is a gift or a curse from a sky god. If your crops fail, it is not bad luck. It is because you have offended a spirit of the land. You have not shown the proper respect. This belief shaped every moment of your day. It was a life filled with a kind of low-level fear, a constant awareness that you were a small part of a much larger living story. This living landscape had a name. They called it the other world. It was not a heaven in the sky or a hell deep underground. It was a parallel reality, a mirror world that existed right alongside our own, hidden by a thin veil. In the other world, the gods lived, heroes feasted, and time itself moved differently. It was the source of all magic, all inspiration, and all life. But it was also a place of immense danger. Humans were not meant to cross over easily. The stories were filled with warnings of mortals who wandered into the other world and were never seen again, or who returned a moment later to find that centuries had passed. The veil between our world and the other world was not always the same thickness. In most places and at most times, it was strong, keeping the two realities separate. But in certain locations and on certain days, the veil grew thin. It became like smoke, shimmering and uncertain. These were the places of power. A hilltop that touched the clouds, a cave that descended into the silent earth, a clearing in an ancient forest. These were the places where the two worlds could touch. It was here, in these sacred spaces, that you could feel the presence of the gods, and it was here that the great rituals had to be performed. What did it feel like for a person to stand in one of these places? Imagine walking into a part of the forest where the birds suddenly fall silent. The light changes, taking on a golden, dreamlike quality. The air itself feels heavy, humming with an energy you cannot see but can feel on your skin. You feel a sense of awe, but also a deep, primal fear. You understand that you are no longer just in the woods. You are standing on the threshold between worlds. You are a guest, and you are not in charge. Every step, every breath must be taken with the utmost respect, because the rules of your world no longer apply here. The calendar itself was a map of when the veil would thin. 2 days were the most important: Beltane and Samhain. Beltane in the spring was a time of life. The veil thinned, and the powers of the other world surged into our own, bringing fertility and growth. But Samhain, at the end of the harvest, was different. It was the Celtic New Year, a time when the world died back to prepare for winter. On this night, the veil did not just thin, it dissolved completely. The border between the living and the dead, between our world and the other world, was gone. It was the most magical and the most dangerous night of the year. For an ordinary person, the night of Samhain was a time to stay inside. It was a time for honoring the ancestors, leaving food out for their spirits who could now walk the earth freely. But it was also a night when darker things could cross over. Monsters, malevolent spirits, and capricious gods could wander out of the other world and cause chaos. The bonfires that were lit on every hilltop were not just for celebration. They were for protection. They were a signal to the spirits of the dark that this place, this home, was protected. It was a night of deep connection to the spirit world, but also of profound anxiety. Because the world was alive and the other world was so close, a special class of people was needed to navigate the relationship between humans and the gods. They were not kings or warriors, but they held more power than either. They were the bridge between the worlds. We know them by a single name, the Druids. The Druids were the spiritual and intellectual leaders of Celtic society. They were the judges, the doctors, the astronomers, and the philosophers. They were the keepers of the sacred knowledge, the ones who understood the secret laws of the universe and how to communicate with the gods who enforced them. The training to become a druid was incredibly long and difficult, sometimes lasting for 20 years, and all of it was done in secret. The druids believed that writing down their sacred knowledge would weaken it, so everything was memorized. Thousands of poems, laws, histories, and ritual instructions were passed down from master to student by word of mouth alone. This is one of the great reasons why we know so little for certain about them. Their most important secrets were never written down. They were designed to be forgotten by the outside world, kept only in the minds of the initiated. They were the original guardians of the forbidden rituals. Imagine approaching a druid for guidance. You would not meet them in a fancy building, but in a quiet grove of oak trees. They would not look like a king with a crown, but their eyes would hold a wisdom that felt ancient. To speak with a druid was to speak with someone who understood the movements of the stars, the language of the birds, and the will of the gods. They could see the patterns that connected all things. Their authority did not come from wealth or weapons. It came from knowledge, from their deep and intimate connection to the living fabric of the cosmos. The Druids did not worship in buildings made of stone and mortar. The very idea would have seemed strange to them. Why build a house for a god when the gods were all around you in the trees, the rivers, and the sky? Their temples were not constructions, but selections. They found the places where the power of the land was already focused. These places were called the nematon. The word means a sacred grove or a clearing in the woods. These were nature's cathedrals, and they were considered far more sacred than anything that could be built by human hands. They were the centers of their spiritual world. A nematon could be many things. It might be a circle of ancient oak trees, whose roots were said to reach down into the other world. It could be a spring of water, bubbling up from the earth, a direct link to the spirits below. It could be an island in the middle of a lake, a place completely separated from the ordinary world. To enter a nematon was to leave the profane world behind and step into the sacred. It was a place of transformation, where a human could speak to a god, and a god could touch the world of humans. This is where the most powerful and secret rituals took place. The selection of a nematon was a careful process. The Druids would have looked for signs. Perhaps a tree that was struck by lightning, but did not die. Or a place where two rivers met. Or an unusual formation of rocks that seemed to echo the constellations in the sky above. They were looking for a place where the energy of the land was concentrated, where the veil was naturally thin. Once chosen, this place was protected. No trees could be cut, no animals hunted. It became a sanctuary, a piece of the other world that had broken through into our own reality. For the common person, the nematon was a place of deep reverence and fear. Most people would never be allowed to enter the most sacred part of the grove. You might approach the edge to leave an offering, a small token of respect for the spirits within. But to go further, to the heart of the sacred space, was a privilege reserved for the Druids and those chosen to participate in the rituals. To stand at the edge of the grove and look into its shadowy depths was to feel a profound sense of your own smallness. You knew you were looking at the center of the world. The central tree in many of these sacred groves was the oak. The Druids revered the oak tree above all others. It was a symbol of strength, wisdom, and endurance. Its great height seemed to touch the sky, and its deep roots connected it to the underworld. It was a living axis, a bridge connecting the three worlds of Celtic belief: the world of the sky, the world of the earth, and the world below. To perform a ritual under the branches of an ancient oak was to place yourself at the very center of creation, drawing power from all three realms at once. Within these sacred groves, the Celts did not just pray, they made offerings. An offering was a way of maintaining balance. If you took something from the land, like a harvest or a successful hunt, you had to give something back. This kept the relationship between humans and the spirits in harmony. The offerings could be simple things: a portion of the grain, a vessel of milk or mead. But sometimes, to ask for a great favor or to appease a truly powerful and angry god, the offering had to be much, much greater. The land, they believed, sometimes demanded a higher price. The Romans, who later conquered many Celtic lands, wrote about the rituals they witnessed in these groves. Their accounts are often biased, designed to make the Celts seem like savages. But they speak of a darker side to the offerings. They describe vast wicker men, giant human-shaped cages, filled with animals and sometimes, they claimed, with humans, and then set ablaze. While likely exaggerated for political reasons, these stories point to a core belief that the most powerful offering you could make to the gods, the ultimate gift to restore balance, was the gift of life itself. This idea is deeply uncomfortable to our modern minds. But for some ancient Celts, it may have been a terrible necessity. Imagine a time of great famine. Your children are starving, the rains have not come, and the gods are clearly angry. Your community is on the verge of collapse. In such a desperate time, a desperate act might seem like the only option. The sacrifice in this context was not an act of casual cruelty. It was a last, desperate attempt to save the entire community by making the most profound offering possible to the spirits who controlled the world. The spirits and gods themselves were not simple beings. They were not just good or evil. Like nature itself, they could be both creative and destructive. A goddess of the river could bring life-giving water to the crops, but she could also bring a devastating flood that washed the village away. The gods were forces of nature, with their own desires, their own anger, and their own needs. The purpose of ritual was not to worship them in the way we might think of it today. The purpose was to negotiate with them, to appease them, and to channel their immense power for the benefit of the human world. To understand the logic of these rituals, we must first understand a core pattern that was woven into the very fabric of Celtic belief. This was the power of the number 3. 3 was the most magical and sacred number. It represented a perfect and complete whole. The world was divided into 3 realms: the sky, the land, and the sea, which also corresponded to the underworld. Time was seen as having 3 phases: the past, the present, and the future. And a human life had 3 stages: youth, adulthood, and old age. This pattern of 3 was everywhere, and it was the key to their magic. This focus on the number 3 is most obvious in their art. We see it in the famous triple spiral, the triskele. Each spiral arm flows into the next, representing a cycle of constant movement and transformation. It could symbolize the 3 realms of the world, or the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. It was not just a decoration. It was a diagram of how the cosmos worked. It was a reminder that nothing was ever static, that everything was part of a great 3-part cycle. To understand the power of three was to understand the engine of the universe. The gods themselves were often seen in threes. Many of the most powerful goddesses were not a single entity, but a trinity. They were three sisters who represented three different aspects of a single concept. For example, a war goddess might appear as the young maiden, the fertile mother, and the old crone. To face this goddess was not to face one being, but three. She was the promise of youth, the power of creation, and the inevitability of death, all at once. This made the gods incredibly complex and powerful, reflecting the multifaceted nature of the world itself. How did this belief in threeness affect an ordinary person's life? It gave them a framework for understanding the world. When they saw a three-leaf clover, it wasn't just a plant. It was a small symbol of the cosmic order. It meant that life was not a straight line, but a cycle. It brought a sense of order to a chaotic and often difficult world. It meant that even in the darkest winter, spring was a guaranteed part of the cycle. And it meant that even in death, there was the promise of rebirth into a new form. It was a belief system that provided a deep sense of balance. The rituals themselves were often structured in threes. A prayer might be repeated 3 times. An offering might be made on 3 consecutive days. The ritual space might be circled 3 times before the ceremony began. This was not a meaningless repetition. It was a way of aligning the human action with the fundamental pattern of the cosmos. By performing the ritual in a pattern of 3, the Druids were tapping into the very structure of reality. They were making their small human actions resonate with the great cosmic song, amplifying their power immensely. One of the most powerful and feared of all the triple goddesses was the Morrigan. Her name is often translated as the Great Queen or the Phantom Queen. She was not one goddess but 3 sisters, Bod, Macha, and Nemain. Together, they were the goddesses of war, fate, and death. They did not cause war, but they reveled in it. They would fly over the battlefield in the form of crows or ravens, their shrieks causing terror and confusion among the soldiers. To see the Morrigan before a battle was a sign that you were about to die. Imagine you are a young warrior, preparing for your first battle. You are terrified. You sit by the fire, sharpening your sword, and you hear a story about the Great Queen. You are told that she can appear as a beautiful young woman, offering a hero her love and her power. But if he rejects her, she will appear at the most critical moments of his life to ensure his downfall. She can also appear as an old woman, washing the bloody armor of a soldier who is about to be killed. She is not simply a goddess of death, she is the goddess of your fate. The Morrigan represented a profound Celtic truth. Creation and destruction are not opposites. They are 2 sides of the same coin. A battle is a terrible, destructive thing, but from that destruction, a new order, a new future can be born. The Morrigan, in her terrifying aspects, embodied this truth. She was the goddess of the chaos that is necessary for new life to begin. A warrior would not pray to her for protection. They would pray to her for an honorable death and for the strength to face the fate that she had already decided for them. Another central figure in the Celtic world was Lugh, the master of all arts. He was not a triple god, but he was a god of many talents. He was a warrior, a smith, a harpist, and a poet. He represented the importance of skill and craftsmanship in Celtic society. In a world without complex technology, everything had to be made by hand. A well-made sword, a beautifully crafted piece of jewelry, or a perfectly told story were not just objects or entertainment. They were seen as containing a kind of magic, a piece of the divine spark of creation. The festival named after him, Lugnasad, was celebrated at the beginning of the harvest. It was a time to celebrate the first fruits of the earth, but also to celebrate the skills of the community. There would be games, contests of strength and artistry, horse races, and feasting. For an ordinary person, it was a time of great joy and relief. The hard work of the summer was paying off. The harvest was beginning, and the community would have food for the winter. It was a celebration of human skill, working in partnership with the generosity of the land and the favor of the gods. But beneath these celebrations and the pantheon of well-known gods, there were older, stranger beliefs. The Celts had a deep reverence for the human head. To them, the head was the seat of the soul. It was the source of consciousness, emotion, and spiritual power. In many of the myths, even after a hero was decapitated, his head could continue to speak, offering wisdom and prophecy. Taking the head of an enemy in battle was not just about proving your victory. It was about capturing their spiritual essence, their power. Archaeologists have found evidence of this cult of the head all across the Celtic world. Skulls have been found carefully placed in sacred wells and rivers, likely as offerings to the water gods. Carvings of heads with large staring eyes are found decorating doorways and sacred sites. They were believed to be powerful protective talismans, guardians that could ward off evil spirits. The head was a source of power so intense that it could persist even after death, a magical object that bridged the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Imagine living in a village where the main gateway was decorated with the preserved heads of your community's greatest enemies. To a modern person, this seems gruesome, but to them, it was a profound statement of strength and security. It told any approaching stranger that this was a place protected by the captured souls of powerful warriors. For the people living inside, it was a source of comfort. It was a physical manifestation of their community's power, a ring of spiritual guardians watching over them day and night. This belief in the power of the head leads us closer to the heart of the forbidden rituals. The rituals were not just about pleasing the gods. They were about a transfer of power. They were about taking the spiritual energy that was concentrated in a sacred place, a sacred plant, or even a sacred person, and channeling it for a specific purpose. This was a dangerous act. Dealing with such raw power was like trying to hold lightning in your hands. It required immense knowledge, precise ceremony, and often a great sacrifice to control the energies being unleashed. One of the most mysterious elements of the sacred sites were the wells and pits. All across the Celtic lands, archaeologists find deep shafts dug into the earth, filled with layers of offerings. These were not just garbage dumps. The objects inside were placed there carefully over many centuries. We find animal bones, weapons, tools, and even human remains. These were not graves. They were portals, openings into the earth, seen as direct gateways to the other world. They were places to send messages and offerings directly to the gods who lived below. What did it mean for someone to approach one of these sacred wells? Imagine standing at the edge of a deep, dark hole in the ground, filled with black water. You cannot see the bottom. The air coming out of it is cold and smells of damp earth. You believe that this is a direct line to the world of the spirits. You are about to drop your offering into the water, perhaps a sword from a fallen enemy, or a precious piece of jewelry. As it disappears into the darkness, you feel you have sent a gift straight into another reality, a plea for help sent across the veil. The water itself was seen as a healing and prophetic element. The spirits of the wells were often goddesses of healing and wisdom. People would travel for miles on pilgrimages to these sacred sites, seeking cures for sickness or answers about the future. They would leave offerings, and in return, hope for a dream or a vision that would provide guidance. The ritual was a transaction. They were giving something of value to the spirit of the well, and they expected to receive something of value, health or knowledge, in return. The power of these places was so strong that they could not be erased. When a new religion, Christianity, arrived in these lands, it could not simply abolish these ancient practices. The belief in the power of the sacred wells was too deeply ingrained in the minds of the people, so a different strategy was used. The old goddess of the well was replaced by a new Christian saint. The well that was once sacred to a Celtic deity became the holy well of a local saint. The practice of pilgrimage and leaving offerings continued, but now it was done in a new name. This process of blending old and new beliefs shows just how fundamental these ideas were. The core concept, that certain places on earth are uniquely powerful and can be used to connect with the divine, did not disappear. It simply changed its clothes. The forbidden ritual of the past was transformed into the accepted prayer of the future. This is how ancient beliefs survive. They do not vanish. They go underground, hiding in plain sight within the stories, traditions, and even the religious practices of the cultures that tried to replace them. So we have a living world, a nearby otherworld, and the druids who act as intermediaries. We have sacred places, the nemetons, where the veil between these worlds is thin, and we have a cosmic system based on the power of three, a system that dictates how rituals must be performed. These are the foundational pieces, but these pieces alone do not explain what made a ritual forbidden. What specific acts were performed in the heart of the sacred grove, on the darkest nights of the year, that were considered so dangerous they had to be stamped out and forgotten? The forbidden rituals were often about transformation. They were not just about asking for a good harvest. They were about fundamentally changing something, either in the world or within a person. One of the most important transformations was that of the king. The king in Celtic society was not just a political leader. He was mystically connected to the land itself. His physical health and moral character were directly tied to the health and fertility of his kingdom. If the king was strong and just, the land would prosper. If he was weak or corrupt, the crops would fail and the kingdom would suffer. Because of this deep connection, the king had to be perfect. He could not have any physical blemish. He had to be a model of generosity, truth, and courage. His reign was a sacred trust. To ensure this connection remained strong, the king had to be symbolically married to the goddess of the land. This was not a literal marriage, but a powerful ritual that bonded him to the spirit of the kingdom he was chosen to protect. This ceremony was at the very heart of the social and spiritual order. It was the ritual that turned a man into a king. This ritual marriage to the land goddess, often known as the sovereignty goddess, was the source of the king's legitimacy. She would appear in the myths, sometimes as a beautiful young woman, and sometimes as a hideous old hag. The true king was the one who would treat her with respect and honor, no matter which form she took. By embracing her in her fearsome aspect, he would prove his worthiness, and she would then transform into a beautiful maiden, granting him the right to rule. It was a test of his character, not just his strength. What did this mean for the people of the kingdom? It meant that their well-being was directly tied to the moral fiber of their leader. They were not just following a man, they were following a man who was the chosen partner of the land itself. It created a powerful bond between the people, their king, and the very ground beneath their feet. But it also created a terrible vulnerability. If the king faltered, if he broke his sacred vows, the entire kingdom was at risk. The land itself, the goddess, would abandon him, bringing famine and disaster. And what happened if the king grew old, or was wounded in battle, or proved to be unjust? The sacred contract was broken. His imperfection was now reflected in the land. The crops would begin to fail, the cattle would sicken. The land was rejecting him. In such a case, the well-being of the entire tribe was at stake. A terrible choice had to be made. To save the land, the king, whose body was no longer perfect, sometimes had to be removed. In the most ancient and extreme traditions, the flawed king had to be sacrificed to return his power to the earth. This is one of the most profound and forbidden of the ancient rituals, the ritual killing of a king. It was not an act of rebellion or murder in their eyes. It was a sacred duty, a necessary sacrifice to restore balance and ensure the survival of the people. The king's life had been given to the land in the first ritual, and now, to heal the land, it had to be given back. The king's blood, spilled on the earth, would replenish its power and allow a new, perfect king to be chosen, to once again enter into a sacred marriage with the goddess. This idea of the sacred king, whose life is tied to the land, is a very old one, found in many cultures. But it helps us understand the immense seriousness of these rituals. This was not simple worship. This was a system of cosmic maintenance. The health of the people and the health of the land were one and the same, and the king was the living bridge between them. The rituals surrounding him were the most important, most powerful, and therefore most secret ceremonies of the entire culture. They held the fate of the nation in their hands. These rituals would have been performed in the deepest part of the Nemeton, far from the eyes of the uninitiated. The details are lost to us, because this was the kind of sacred knowledge the Druids would never have written down. We can only piece together clues from mythology, from archaeology, and from the horrified writings of outsiders who did not understand what they were seeing. They saw a brutal sacrifice, but the Celts would have seen a necessary act of renewal, the painful but essential turning of the great wheel of life, death, and rebirth. So the temple was the sacred grove. The purpose was to maintain the balance between our world and the other world. And one of the most central rituals involved the king, the living embodiment of the health of the land. But the king was just one pillar of the world. There were other forces, other gods, who required their own forms of appeasement. These rituals dealt with the chaotic forces that existed outside the ordered world of the kingdom, the gods of the wild, the untamed powers of nature, and the gods of war. The rituals for these chaotic gods were different. They were not about maintaining balance, but about negotiating with primal and often destructive forces. This is where we encounter the darkest aspects of the forbidden ceremonies. These were the rituals designed to call upon the war goddesses, to ask for their favor in battle, or to placate the spirits of the wild places to prevent them from destroying the human world. To do this, one had to make an offering that matched the savage nature of the god being addressed. It required a descent into a much older and much bloodier form of belief. To understand these darker rituals, picture yourself as that young warrior again, the night before battle. The fires are burning low. The druids begin to chant, their voices a low drone that seems to come from the earth itself. They are not speaking to the bright gods of the sun or the harvest. They are calling out to the Raven Queen, the Morrigan. They ask her to feast on the blood of their enemies, to grant the warriors a battle fury, a divine madness that will make them immune to fear and pain. You feel a strange energy building in the camp, a mix of terror and wild exhilaration. The offering required for such a ritual had to be potent. It often involved blood. The Celts believed that blood was the river of life, carrying the soul's energy. A ritual sacrifice, whether of an animal or, in the darkest tales, a human prisoner, was about releasing that energy in a sudden, powerful burst. This spiritual power was then directed towards the goddess, a meal to gain her favor. To our eyes, it is an act of shocking violence. To them, it was a necessary and powerful magical operation, feeding the gods of death to ensure their own survival on the battlefield the next day. The warrior would participate directly. He might be marked with the blood of the sacrifice, a sacred anointment to place him under the goddess's protection. He might drink a special potion, a mix of herbs and alcohol, designed to alter his state of mind and open him up to the battle fury. As he drank, he was no longer just a man. He was becoming an instrument of the Morrigan, a vessel for her destructive power. He was preparing to leave his ordinary human consciousness behind and become something else entirely, something wild and terrifying, for the duration of the coming fight. This transformation was often visible. Celtic warriors were famous for going into battle with their bodies painted with blue spiral patterns, a substance called woad. This was not just decoration, it was a magical act. The spirals were symbols of cosmic energy. By painting them on his skin, The warrior was drawing the power of the universe onto his body. He was making himself a living embodiment of the chaotic, creative forces of the world. His naked, painted body was a statement that he was leaving the world of human rules behind and entering the world of divine, mythic combat. They would also use sound. The most feared sound on an ancient battlefield was the carnix. This was a great bronze war horn, often standing taller than a man, shaped like a serpent or a boar's head. When blown, it created a horrifying, unearthly sound, a deep shriek that was said to demoralize enemies and call the war gods to the fight. For the Celtic warrior, hearing the carnix was the final trigger. It was the voice of the goddess herself, signaling that the time for ritual was over and the time for glorious, terrifying action had begun. After the battle, the ritual was not over. The promises made to the gods had to be fulfilled. The weapons and armor of the defeated enemies were considered to belong to the spirits of war. They would be taken to a sacred place, often a lake or a bog, and they would be ritually broken. Swords were bent, shields were smashed. This act of destruction killed the object, releasing its spirit as an offering. Archaeologists have found massive deposits of these ritually destroyed weapons, a silent testament to centuries of violent offerings made to the unseen gods of the battlefield. And then there was the matter of the heads. As we have seen, the head was the seat of the soul. The heads of the most powerful enemies were taken as the ultimate trophies. They were a gift for the gods, but also a source of power for the tribe. They would be brought back to the village, displayed at the gates, or placed in niches within the sacred grove. The spirits of these enemy warriors were now bound to serve and protect the victors. The head was not just a symbol of victory, it was a captured piece of the otherworld's power, now harnessed for the tribe's benefit. Let us leave the battlefield and walk deeper into the woods, away from the affairs of men. Here, in the wild, untamed places, live different gods who require different rituals. In the shadows of the oldest forests lived the horned god. We see his image carved on ancient stones, a powerful figure with the antlers of a stag. He is a god of animals, fertility, and the deep, wild earth. He is not like the gods of the tribe. He is older, more primal, and he represents the untamed life force of nature itself. He is a power that can be negotiated with, but never controlled. For a hunter, this god was a constant presence. Before entering the forest to hunt, he would make a small offering at the edge of the woods, a piece of bread, a splash of ale. It was a request for permission. He was entering the god's home, and he intended to take one of the god's children, the deer or the boar. The hunt was a sacred act. It was not a sport. It was a dangerous and respectful negotiation between the human world and the world of the wild. If the hunter was successful, he would leave a part of the animal behind, a thank you gift for the horned god. The rituals dedicated to this god were not about fury or death, but about connection. They were about blurring the line between human and animal. Shamans, or druids who specialized in this magic, would wear antlers and animal skins. They would dance to the beat of a drum, entering a trance state where their spirit could leave their body and run with the wolf pack or fly with the eagle. This was a forbidden knowledge, the secret of how to shed one's humanity and temporarily become a part of the wild soul of the world. It was a path to immense power and wisdom, but also to madness. Imagine a young person in the tribe who is found to have this shamanic gift. They might be prone to visions, able to understand the language of birds, or feel a connection to the animals of the forest. They would be taken by the druids to be trained. This training would be a long and terrifying ordeal. They would be sent into the wilderness alone to face starvation, fear, and the wild spirits. They had to die to their old human self to be reborn as a bridge between the worlds. Their role was to speak for the wild, to remind the tribe that they were a part of nature, not its master. These shamanic rituals used the power of nature directly. The druids were master herbalists. They knew which plants could heal, which could poison, and which could open the mind to the other world. Mistletoe, which grew on their sacred oak trees, was particularly powerful. It was a plant that lived between the sky and the earth, never touching the ground. It was seen as a manifestation of pure life force. When harvested with a golden sickle under the right moon, it was used in potions to promote fertility and give access to visions. It was a key that could unlock the door to the other reality. For the ordinary villager, these wild rituals were a source of both comfort and fear. They knew that the shamans were working to keep the balance with the dangerous spirits of the forest. They were grateful for this protection, but they also feared the shaman. They saw someone who walked in two worlds, who spoke to beings they could not see, and who wielded a power that came from the untamed darkness beyond the village walls. The shaman was a vital part of the community, but they were also forever an outsider, marked by their intimate connection to the forbidden, wild side of reality. This deep connection to nature, this belief that everything was alive, meant that the future was not a blank page. It was already written in the flight of birds, in the shapes of the clouds, in the patterns of stones cast on the ground. The world was constantly speaking, and the Druids were the ones who knew how to listen. The art of seeing the future was called divination, and it was one of their most important and secret practices. A king would never go to war, a farmer would never plant his fields, without first consulting the signs to see if the time was right. Imagine your village is choosing a new king. The old one has died. The stability of your entire world depends on choosing the right successor. How is this choice made? It is not a simple election. The decision is not left to men alone. It is a question that must be asked of the gods. The Druids would perform one of their most strange and forbidden rituals, the Tarbface, or the Bull Feast. This was a ceremony of prophecy, designed to receive a direct message from the other world, revealing the name of the one true king, who was favored by the goddess of the land. The ritual began with the sacrifice of a great white bull, a sacred animal. A chosen seer, a man gifted with the second sight, would then eat the bull's flesh and drink its blood. After this ritual meal, he would lie down to sleep, wrapped in the animal's hide. 4 other druids would stand over him, chanting a spell of truth, a powerful incantation to protect him on his spirit journey and ensure that what he saw was a true vision, not a trick of a malevolent spirit. He was about to travel into the heart of the other world to bring back a secret. What would that seer have experienced? As he drifted into the enchanted sleep, his consciousness would leave his body. He would find himself in a dreamscape that was more real than waking life. He was in the other world. Here he would see a vision of the man who was destined to be the next king. He might see the man's face, or hear his name, or see him performing a specific action. This was not a guess or an interpretation. It was a direct revelation. His job was to remember it perfectly and bring it back to the world of the living. The next morning, the seer would awaken and announce what he had seen in his dream. The man he named was then declared the rightful king. To an outsider, this process seems insane. To leave the most important political decision of the tribe to one man's dream seems like a recipe for chaos. But for the Celts, it was the most logical thing in the world. They were not asking a man for his opinion, they were asking the gods, through a sacred and time-honored ritual technology. The authority came not from the seer, but from the other world itself. This tells us something crucial about the forbidden rituals. They were not just for worship, they were functional. They were a set of spiritual tools used to govern society, to heal the sick, to ensure victory in war, and to maintain the cosmic order. The sacred grove was not just a church, it was also a laboratory, a hospital, and a courtroom. The Druids were not just priests, they were the scientists and engineers of the sacred. Their power was based on their ability to produce real-world results by manipulating the hidden forces of the universe. So we have a world woven together by ritual. The king is married to the land, the warriors are filled with divine fury, The shamans walk with the spirits of the wild, and the future is revealed in prophetic dreams. It is a complete and complex system, where the spiritual and the practical are one and the same. It is a world of deep enchantment, but also of constant, bloody negotiation with powerful and unseen forces. For centuries, this was the reality. But this ancient world, with its secret groves and its otherworld portals, was about to face an existential threat. The threat came from the south. It was the Roman Empire. The Romans were a different kind of people. Their world was not governed by the whispers of spirits in the trees, but by the clear, written laws of the Senate. Their power came not from prophetic dreams, but from the disciplined legions, the straight roads, and the brutal efficiency of their military machine. They believed in gods, but their gods were orderly and civilized, patrons of the state. They looked at the Celtic world and saw not a different kind of order, but a lack of order. They saw chaos, and they sought to conquer it. When the Roman legions marched into Celtic lands, like Gaul and Britain, it was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of realities. The Roman soldiers saw a forest and thought of it as a source of timber for building forts, or as a dangerous place where barbarians could hide. The Celtic warrior saw the same forest and knew it was the home of a powerful god, a living being that must be respected. These two ways of seeing the world could not coexist peacefully. One would have to consume the other. The Romans were particularly disturbed by the Druids. They saw them as the heart of the Celtic resistance. The Roman leaders, like Julius Caesar, wrote about the Druids with a mixture of fascination and disgust. They respected their knowledge of astronomy and philosophy, but they were horrified by their rituals, especially the stories of human sacrifice. To the orderly Roman mind, the Druids were dangerous political agitators, using their strange religion to incite the tribes to rebellion against the civilizing force of Rome. They knew that to truly conquer the Celts, they had to first destroy the Druids. The final stand of the Druids in Britain took place on an island called Mona, now known as Anglesey in Wales. This island was a sacred center, a great nematon filled with sacred groves and shrines. It was the Druids' most holy place. The Roman governor, Suetonius Paulinus, decided to make an example of it. He gathered his legions on the coast and prepared to cross the strait. For the Roman soldiers, this was more than just another battle. They were about to invade the heart of their enemy's magic, a place they had been taught to fear. Imagine being one of those Roman soldiers, standing on the shore, looking across the water at the island of Mona. The Celtic warriors were lined up on the opposite beach, shouting their battle cries, but among them were women in black robes, with wild hair, waving torches, and screaming curses. And behind them all stood the Druids, with their arms raised to the sky, calling upon their gods to strike down the invaders. It was a scene of pure, terrifying psychological warfare. The Romans were facing not just an army, but the living power of a religion they did not understand. The Romans, however, were disciplined. Their commanders urged them forward, telling them to ignore the women and the unarmed priests. They crossed the water, and a terrible battle ensued. The Roman legions were ruthless and efficient. They cut down the warriors, they burned the sacred groves, and they slaughtered the Druids. It was a deliberate act of cultural destruction. They were not just conquering a piece of land, they were trying to kill a belief system. They were pulling the Celtic world up by its spiritual roots, hoping it would wither and die. For the Celtic people, the destruction of Mona was a catastrophe. It was like the heart had been ripped out of their world. Their most learned elders, the keepers of the sacred knowledge, were gone. Their most holy place was desecrated and burned. The oral tradition, the great chain of memory that had been passed down for centuries, was broken. The forbidden rituals could no longer be performed with their full power and authority. It was the beginning of the end for the old ways. The world had been wounded, and the veil to the other world was growing thicker. The Roman occupation lasted for hundreds of years. During this time, the old Celtic gods did not simply vanish. Instead, they began to merge with the Roman gods. A Celtic god of the sky might become identified with the Roman god Jupiter. A goddess of the hot springs in Britain became associated with the Roman Minerva. This blending happened all over the empire. The Romans were often happy to allow it, as it made the local populations easier to control. The outer forms of worship changed, but some of the old spirits lived on, hidden behind new Roman names. For an ordinary person living during this time, their spiritual life became a mixture. They might go to a beautiful stone temple built in the Roman style, but inside, the statue they prayed to might have two names, one Roman and one Celtic. They were trying to navigate a new world, holding on to their ancestral beliefs while also participating in the dominant culture of the empire. The raw, wild power of the old rituals was being slowly tamed, civilized, and absorbed into a more structured and predictable system of religion. The direct line to the other world was being replaced by a more organized priesthood and formal temples. The Romans brought writing on a large scale. While the Druids had forbidden the writing of sacred knowledge, the Romans wrote everything down. This had a profound effect. Stories and myths that had once been fluid, changing with each telling, were now being written into fixed forms. This preserved some of the stories, but it also changed their nature. It took the living, breathing spirit of the oral tradition and pinned it to the page like a butterfly. The knowledge was saved, but some of the magic was lost in the process of translation, from sacred speech to ordinary text. This Roman world, with its blended gods and written laws, created a new kind of stability. The era of constant tribal warfare began to fade. But this stability would not last. The Roman Empire itself was changing from within. A new religion was sweeping through it, a faith that came from the Middle East. It was a religion with only one God, a God who was jealous and would tolerate no others before him. This new faith was Christianity, and its arrival would prove to be a far greater threat to the old Celtic ways than the Roman legions had ever been. When Christian missionaries, like St. Patrick in Ireland, began to arrive, they brought a completely new way of understanding the world. For the Christians, there was only one God, who was entirely good. All the other supernatural beings of the old world, the spirits of the rivers, the gods of the forest, the fairies of the other world, were relabeled. They were not seen as complex nature spirits anymore. They were now seen as either angels serving the one true God, or, more often, as demons and devils, servants of evil, who were trying to lead humanity astray. Imagine being a Celtic farmer. For your entire life, you have left a small offering of milk for the spirits that live in the hills behind your farm. You do this to keep them happy, to maintain balance. It is an ancient tradition that your grandfather and his grandfather did before him. Then, a Christian priest arrives in your village. He tells you that the beings you have been honoring are not spirits of the land. They are demons, and by making offerings to them, you are damning your eternal soul to a fiery hell. This was not just a theological debate. It was a fundamental attack on the very fabric of their reality. The Christian missionaries were often very clever. They understood that they could not simply erase thousands of years of belief overnight. So they used a strategy of conversion and absorption. Just as the Romans had blended their gods with the Celtic ones, the Christians now blended their saints with the old gods. The powerful goddess Brigid, a deity of fire, poetry, and healing, was transformed into Saint Brigid of Kildare. Her sacred fires were kept burning, but now they burned in the name of a Christian saint. The old ways were given a new mask, allowing them to survive. The sacred sites were also converted. The Christian missionaries would often build their new churches and monasteries on the very same spots where the Druids' sacred groves had stood. They built on the ancient nematons, on the hilltops, and beside the holy wells. They knew these places were already considered powerful by the local population. By claiming them for their own god, they were making a powerful statement. They were demonstrating that their god was stronger than the old spirits of the land, that he had conquered them and taken their sacred ground for his own. For the Celtic people, this must have been a time of profound confusion and spiritual conflict. Their entire worldview was being turned upside down. The rituals that had sustained their ancestors for centuries were now being called witchcraft and devil worship. The sacred groves where they had felt the presence of the gods were being cut down to build wooden churches. Some people would have converted out of true faith. Others might have converted for political or economic advantage. And many would have tried to live in two worlds at once, praying to the Christian God in public while secretly leaving offerings for the old spirits in private. The Druids, or what was left of their tradition after the Roman purges, were now faced with an impossible choice. They were the keepers of the forbidden rituals, the masters of a complex spiritual technology. The Christian church saw them as its direct rivals. They were labeled as evil sorcerers, pagan priests who dealt with demons. Their knowledge was now seen as the ultimate heresy. They were hunted, their practices were outlawed, and their sacred traditions were declared to be the work of the devil. The pressure to abandon the old ways was immense. With the destruction of the Druid schools and the criminalization of their practices, the great oral tradition was finally shattered. The knowledge could no longer be passed down safely from master to student. What followed was a period of forgetting. The precise details of the rituals, the meanings of the sacred symbols, the thousands of memorized poems and laws, much of this began to fade from memory. The world of the Celts became a world of whispers and echoes. The forbidden rituals were not just forbidden anymore, they were becoming lost, buried under a new faith. But they did not vanish completely. The storytellers, the keepers of the myths, still had a role to play. In places like Ireland, which was never conquered by Rome, a class of poets and storytellers known as the Fili inherited some of the Druids' social standing. They were not priests, but they were the guardians of the old tales. Christian monks, in their new monasteries, began to write these stories down for the first time, but they did not write them down as holy scripture. They wrote them down as history, as folklore, as tales of a lost and magical past. This act of writing was both a rescue and a transformation. The monks saved the stories of the gods and heroes from being forgotten entirely, but they also changed them. They added Christian elements, trying to fit the old pagan narratives into their new Christian worldview. The gods were often demoted. They were no longer the powerful rulers of the universe. They became historical kings and queens from a long ago age, or they were transformed into the fairy folk who lived in mounds under the earth. The gods were being tucked away, made smaller and less threatening. So the Morrigan, the terrifying goddess of war and fate, was slowly reimagined. In some later tales, she becomes a more ambiguous fairy queen, a powerful but less divine figure. Lu of the Long Arm, the master of all arts, fades into the background of folklore. The horned god, with his animal antlers, was particularly problematic for the Christians. He was easily demonized, his image becoming one of the primary sources for the popular depiction of the Christian devil. The old gods were not killed. They were imprisoned in stories, their characters rewritten to suit the needs of a new world. The forbidden rituals suffered a similar fate. They were remembered, but as cautionary tales. Stories were told of foolish heroes who stumbled into fairy mounds and were trapped there forever. The sacred groves of the Druids became the haunted forests of fairy tales, places that good people should avoid. The once holy night of Samhain, when the veil to the other world dissolved, was recast as a night when evil spirits and goblins roamed the earth. The old religion was being turned into superstition, its power acknowledged but reframed as something dangerous and evil. How did this long process of forgetting feel to the people living through it? Imagine being an old woman, sitting by the fire with your grandchild. You remember the stories your grandmother told you. Stories of the great queen and the sacred wells. But you are afraid to tell them to the child in the same way. The village priest has warned against such pagan tales. So you change the story. The goddess becomes a powerful witch. The sacred well becomes a cursed spring. You are trying to protect your grandchild and your culture by disguising it, but with every change, another piece of the original meaning is lost forever. Over many centuries, this process continued. The deep, philosophical understanding behind the rituals faded away. All that was left were the folk traditions. People would still leave offerings at wells, but they might not remember the name of the goddess who once lived there. They would still light bonfires on the old festival nights, but they would say it was to scare away witches, not to honor the sun god. The skeleton of the old belief system remained, but the soul, the deep druidic knowledge that had given it meaning, was gone. The why had been forgotten, only the what remained. The temples themselves, the sacred groves, suffered the most. Without the druids to protect them, they were just forests. The ancient oaks were cut down for timber to build cathedrals and ships. The sacred stones were sometimes broken up for building materials or incorporated into church walls. The landscape itself was being tamed and reconsecrated. The places where the veil had once been thin were now sealed shut, covered over by a new layer of belief that insisted there was only one world and one way to God. The age of magic was officially over. And so, the silence we spoke of at the beginning fell upon the land. The chants of the druids were replaced by the ringing of church bells. The great war horns were replaced by choir song. The sacred groves became quiet woods. The knowledge of the forbidden rituals went into a long, deep sleep. It seemed as though the new world had won a total victory, that the old ways had been completely and utterly erased from existence. For over 1,000 years, this silence was almost complete. It seemed that the story had come to an end. But a story that powerful never truly ends. It just waits. The echoes were always there, buried in the folklore, in the names of places, in the superstitions of the countryside. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, a new kind of scholar began to emerge. They were not priests or monks. They were antiquarians, folklorists, and archaeologists. They began to look at the past, not as a time of darkness and superstition, but as a lost world of wonder and mystery. They began digging, both in the earth and in the old manuscripts. They were trying to hear the whispers again. These scholars began to piece the puzzle together. They translated the old Irish and Welsh myths that the monks had written down. They excavated the bogs and found the ritually sacrificed weapons. They mapped the ancient stone circles and realized they aligned with the movements of the sun and stars. They were rediscovering the lost grammar of the Celtic cosmos. They did not have the full picture. The secret oral teachings of the Druids were gone forever, but they could see the faint outline of the world that had been lost. The forbidden rituals were being rediscovered, not as a living practice, but as a historical mystery. This rediscovery has continued to this day. We now know more about the Druids and Celtic belief than at any time in the last 1,000 years. But our knowledge is different. It is an intellectual knowledge, a collection of facts and theories. The Druids' knowledge was a living, experiential thing. We can read about the bull feast ritual, but we cannot know what it truly felt like to be that seer, traveling into the other world. We are like people standing on the outside of a great cathedral, admiring its architecture, but we have lost the key to get inside. This has created a deep sense of fascination and longing in the modern world. We live in a world that often feels disenchanted, a world of science and technology where the old magic seems to have fled. The story of the Celtic world, with its living landscape and its otherworld portals, speaks to a deep hunger for that lost connection. But this raises a final, crucial question. The original rituals were suppressed and forgotten. How did these ancient, forbidden ceremonies, these powerful ideas about gods, spirits, and the sacred, managed to echo all the way down to our present time? The answer is that they did not survive. Not in their true form. A complete ritual is like a living body. It requires all its parts to function. The Druidic knowledge was the brain, the sacred grove was the heart, and the people's belief was the blood. When the brain and heart were destroyed, the body died. But the spirit, the essential ideas, did not vanish. They broke apart into 1,000 pieces. These fragments then hid themselves in the safest places they could find, in the stories told to children, in the games played at festivals, and in the quiet, unspoken superstitions of everyday life. Imagine you are a farmer in medieval Ireland, 1,000 years after the fall of the Druids. You are a devout Christian. You go to church every Sunday. But on one particular night of the year, the night we now call Halloween, you do something strange. You leave a bowl of food on your doorstep before you go to bed. If someone asks you why, you might say it is for the souls of the dead, or for the fairies, so they do not cause mischief. You do not know that you are performing a faint echo of a Samhain ritual, an offering to the ancestors whose spirits walk the earth. This is how the forbidden rituals survived their own death. They became folk customs. Their original, profound meanings were forgotten, but the actions themselves were passed down from generation to generation. People continued to perform them, not out of pagan faith, but out of simple tradition. This is what we have always done. That sentence is the most powerful, magical incantation of all. It allows an idea to survive long after its original purpose has been lost to memory. The rituals lived on, not as religion, but as habit, as part of the rhythm of the year. Let us follow the journey of one of these fragments. We will look at the most powerful night of the Celtic year, Samhain. This was the night the veil dissolved, when the worlds of the living and the dead merged. It was a time of prophecy, of honoring the dead, and of great danger from malevolent spirits. The Christian Church could not erase a festival this important. So instead, they covered it over. In the 8th century, the Church officially designated November 1st as All Saints' Day or All Hallows' Day, a day to honor all the Christian saints. This was a brilliant move. The great festival of the Celtic dead was now replaced by a great festival of the Christian dead. The night before All Hallows' Day, October 31st, became known as All Hallows' Eve, which over time was shortened to Halloween. The name was changed, but the feeling of the night remained. It was still seen as a time when the spirit world was unusually close and active. The old fears and the old traditions did not die. They simply put on a new Christian mask and continued, a pagan ghost hiding within a holy day. What did this mean for the common person? It meant their world was a strange blend of two realities. On Sunday, the priest would warn them against pagan superstitions, but on All Hallows' Eve, their own grandmother would tell them to stay inside, to avoid traveling after dark, because the spirits were abroad. They lived with one foot in the new world of Christian theology and one foot in the old world of folk magic. The fear and respect for the spirit world that was central to the Samhain rituals was still very much alive, even if it was no longer part of an organized religion. One of the most important Samhain traditions was the bonfire. The Druids would light huge fires on hilltops. These were partly for purification, and partly to act as a beacon of protection against dark spirits. This tradition continued straight through the Christian era. People would light massive bonfires on Halloween. They would say it was to ward off the devil or evil witches. They did not know they were continuing a ritual that was once designed to negotiate with the Morrigan or other gods of the other world. The fire's protective power was a memory that outlived the names of the gods it was meant for. Another ancient tradition was disguise. During the chaos of Samhain, when spirits both good and bad could walk the earth, it was believed to be dangerous to go outside. A malevolent spirit might recognize you and cause you harm. So people would wear costumes and masks, They would dress as ghosts, goblins, or other fearsome creatures. The purpose was to fool the spirits. If you looked like one of them, they would pass you by without causing trouble. It was a form of magical camouflage, a way to move safely through the world on its most dangerous night. This practice of disguise evolved into the tradition known as guising or mumming. People, often young men, would go from house to house in costume, singing songs or reciting verses in exchange for food. This looks to us like the beginning of trick-or-treating, but it was something deeper. The food they received was not just a treat. It was often seen as an offering, given on behalf of the household's dead ancestors, whose spirits the guisers were thought to represent. It was a folk drama, a playful reenactment of the ancient communion between the living and the dead. So we can see the pattern. The core elements of the Samhain rituals never truly disappeared. Honoring the dead, fearing evil spirits, lighting protective fires, and wearing disguises. All of these survived, but they were stripped of their original context. They became children's games and folk traditions. The deep, terrifying, and sacred reality of the Druids' world was slowly transformed into the spooky, festive, and much safer world of Halloween. The forbidden ritual had been domesticated, made into something the new world could tolerate. But there is another piece of the puzzle, one that connects directly back to the ancient cult of the head. Let us return to that central, and to us, gruesome, belief that the human head was the seat of the soul, a source of spiritual power that could be used for protection. This belief was too powerful to be erased, but too shocking to survive in its original form. It had to be transformed into a symbol. The people needed a way to harness the protective power of the head without performing the violent act of taking one. They needed a substitute, a stand-in that could do the same magical work. And they found it in the humble vegetables that grew in their fields. In Ireland and Scotland, people began to carve faces into large turnips and potatoes. They would hollow them out and place a burning piece of coal or a small candle inside. These were the original jack-o'-lanterns. To us, they are a fun decoration, but their original purpose was deeply serious. The carved turnip was a symbolic head. With its fierce face and its inner light, its soul, it was placed in windows or by doorways to act as a guardian. It was a man-made talisman, designed to perform the exact same function as the real heads that once protected the gateways of their ancestors, forts. It was a powerful ward against evil spirits. This practice was tied to a specific folktale, the story of a man named Stingy Jack. Jack was a trickster who had fooled the devil himself, trapping him and only letting him go after the devil promised never to take his soul. When Jack died, he was too sinful to get into heaven, but because of his deal, the devil couldn't take him into hell either. So Jack was doomed to wander the earth for eternity, in the darkness between the worlds. The only thing he had for light was a single burning coal, which he carried inside a carved-out turnip. He became Jack of the Lantern. This story is a perfect example of how pagan ideas were repackaged in a Christian world. The wandering spirit of Jack is a folk memory of the restless spirits that were believed to cross over during Samhain. The lantern he carries, the carved turnip, is a direct link to the ancient cult of the head. The story provides a new, Christian-friendly explanation for a very old, very pagan practice. People could carve their protective heads, their turnip lanterns, not as an act of pagan ritual, but as a way to scare off the lonely spirit of poor old Stingy Jack. Imagine being a child in 18th century Ireland. On Halloween night, your father brings in a big turnip from the field. You watch as he painstakingly carves a frightening face into its tough skin. He tells you the story of Stingy Jack as he works. When he lights the candle inside, the grotesque face flickers to life, casting dancing shadows on the cottage walls. You feel a thrill of fear, but also a sense of safety. You know that with this magical, glowing face watching over your home, the dark things that wander the world on this night will not be able to get in. The echoes of other rituals also survived in similar ways. Let us look at the other great festival, Beltane, which took place in the spring. This was the counterpart to Samhain. Where Samhain was about death and darkness, Beltane was about life, light, and fertility. It was a celebration of the sun's return and the rebirth of the land. Great bonfires were lit, just as they were at Samhain, but for a different reason. The Beltane fires were for purification and to encourage the sun's power. Cattle were driven between two bonfires to protect them from disease before they were sent to their summer pastures. This festival of life was also too important to be forgotten. It survived as the folk festival of May Day. All across Europe, people would celebrate the 1st of May with traditions that were faint echoes of the ancient Beltane rituals. They would light bonfires, though they might have forgotten the original purpose of driving their cattle through them. They would decorate their homes with fresh flowers and green branches, a memory of celebrating the return of the land's fertility. The deep religious meaning was gone, but the joy of the season and the core actions remained. The most famous symbol of this survival is the maypole. Young people would go into the woods, cut down a tall tree, often a birch, and bring it back to the village green. They would decorate it with ribbons and flowers and dance around it. To them, it was just a fun tradition. They did not know that they were reenacting a powerful ancient ritual. The pole was a symbol of the great sacred tree, the axis of the world that stood at the center of the nematon. The dance was a fertility ritual, a celebration of the life force that was returning to the world. For a young person in a small village, May Day was the most exciting day of the year. It was a day of freedom, feasting, and celebration after a long, hard winter. The strict rules of the church were relaxed. It was a day that belonged to the people and to the land. The dancing around the maypole was a moment of pure communal joy. They felt a connection to each other and to the season of new life. They were experiencing a faint echo of the same ecstatic connection to nature that their Celtic ancestors had felt during the great Beltane rituals. The Christian church was always suspicious of these May Day celebrations. They saw the maypole as a pagan symbol and the wild dancing as immoral. In some places and times they tried to ban the practice, but they were never fully successful. The tradition was too old and too beloved. It had a power that came from the earth itself, from the simple, undeniable joy of seeing the world turn green again after the grayness of winter. The spirit of Beltane, the celebration of life, was too strong to be completely suppressed. It just kept bubbling up from below. So we see these fragments of the forbidden rituals surviving for centuries, hidden within the major festivals of the year. Samhain's darkness becomes Halloween. Beltane's light becomes May Day. But what about the other beliefs? What about the triple goddess, the sacred waters, and the other world itself? These ideas also survived, but in a more subtle form. They went underground, into the world of folklore, and became the foundation for the vast and complex mythology of the fairies, the people of the mounds, the Sidae. The old gods, who could no longer be worshipped, were not entirely forgotten. As we saw, they were demoted. They became the kings and queens of the fairies. The other world was no longer a parallel divine reality. It became fairyland, a magical but dangerous place that existed just beyond the edges of the human world. The stories the monks had written down were retold and embellished by generations of storytellers, preserving the memory of the gods, but recasting them in these new, diminished roles. The Morrigan was no longer a goddess of fate, but a fearsome banshee whose cry foretold a death. What did this mean for the person telling or hearing these stories? It meant they still lived in an enchanted world, even though they believed in the one Christian God. The landscape around them was still populated by these other, older powers. The strange rock formation on the hill was a fairy castle. The ring of mushrooms in the field was a place where the fairies danced at night. To disturb these places was to risk their anger. This belief kept a sense of the sacredness of the land alive. It was a way of remembering that the world was more than just what you could see. The holy wells also survived, but in a disguised form. As we saw, many were rededicated to Christian saints. People continued to visit them for healing. They would tie scraps of cloth, called cluties, to the branches of a nearby tree. Each scrap represented a prayer or a wish for a cure. As the cloth rotted away, the sickness was believed to go with it. This is a direct continuation of the ancient practice of leaving offerings for the spirit of the well. The name of the spirit had changed, but the fundamental ritual, the transaction of giving an offering to a sacred place in exchange for a blessing, remained identical. All of these fragments, the Halloween traditions, the May Day festivals, the fairy stories, the holy wells, were carried across Europe for centuries. They were like seeds, dormant but still alive, waiting for the right conditions to grow again. For a long time, they remained local folk traditions. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, something happened that would take these small, regional customs and spread them across the entire globe. Millions of people, particularly from Ireland, were forced to leave their homes because of famine and poverty, and they carried these seeds of memory with them across the ocean. When Irish immigrants arrived in America, they brought their stories and their traditions with them. They brought the tales of Stingy Jack and the custom of carving turnips on All Hallows Eve. But in America, they found a new vegetable that was much larger, softer, and easier to carve than a turnip. It was the pumpkin. And so, the ancient tradition adapted to its new home. The protective head talisman, which had transformed from a human skull to a carved turnip, now made its final transformation into the familiar orange pumpkin we know today as the jack-o'-lantern. The other traditions also changed in this new environment. America in the late 19th and early 20th century was a great melting pot of cultures. It was also a rapidly industrializing and commercializing society. The old, spooky, and sometimes dangerous folk traditions of Halloween began to be tamed and repackaged. They were gradually transformed from a night of spiritual significance into a holiday primarily for children. The focus shifted away from appeasing spirits and towards community parties, costumes, and collecting candy. The sacred was becoming secular. The practice of guising underwent a major change. The idea that the costumed figures represented the spirits of the dead and that the food given was an offering faded away almost completely. It was replaced by the much simpler and more playful idea of trick-or-treat. The threat of a mischievous trick was a faint, playful echo of the very real fear people once had of angering the spirits on this night. The exchange was no longer a sacred ritual of communion with the dead, but a fun game for children to get sweets. Imagine that Irish immigrant family again, perhaps now in the 1920s in a big American city. The grandmother might still remember the old stories and the old fears associated with the night. She might whisper a warning to her grandchildren about the spirits. But the children are more excited about their store-bought costumes and the promise of candy. They live in a world of electric lights and paved streets, a world that seems to have no room for the ancient darkness of Samhain. The last threads connecting the tradition to its sacred, ritualistic past were beginning to break. By the mid-20th century, this new American version of Halloween had become a massive commercial holiday. Greeting card companies, candy manufacturers, and costume makers all had a stake in promoting this safe, fun, and profitable version of the festival. Through movies, television shows, and advertising, this Americanized Halloween was then exported back to the rest of the world, including to Ireland and Scotland, where it had all begun. The ancient festival, after a journey of thousands of years and thousands of miles, had returned home, but in a form its originators would not have recognized. The same thing happened to the echoes of the other rituals. The idea of the horned god, the master of the wild, which had been turned into a figure of the devil, was now being reimagined again. In the growing environmental movement, people started to see this figure not as evil, but as a symbol of the untamed natural world that modern society was destroying. The forbidden god of the ancient forest was slowly being rehabilitated, re-emerging as a symbol of a lost connection to nature that many people felt a desperate need to rediscover. Even the Druids themselves were reborn. In the 18th century, a revival movement began, with people who were fascinated by the ancient Celts, forming new groups and calling themselves Druids. These modern Druid orders had no direct lineage to the ancient ones. The chain had been broken, but they studied the old myths and the archaeology, and they tried to reconstruct the old ways as best they could. They began performing new rituals in the ancient stone circles, trying to reawaken the sleeping magic of the sacred sites. The silence was being broken by new voices. This modern revival, often called neo-paganism, is a direct response to the disenchanted world we live in. For people who feel that mainstream religions no longer speak to them, and that a purely scientific worldview is emotionally unsatisfying, these ancient Celtic ideas offer a powerful alternative. The belief in a living, conscious earth, the idea of a magical otherworld, the reverence for ancestors, these things resonate deeply with a modern hunger for meaning and connection. The forbidden rituals are being reinvented for a new age. What does it feel like to be one of these modern pagans? Imagine standing in a circle of friends at Stonehenge, or another ancient site on the night of the solstice. You are not just a tourist. You are there to perform a ritual, one that you and your group have created, inspired by the old ways. You feel the cold night air, you see the stars above, and you feel a connection, not just to each other, but to the thousands of years of human history that have unfolded on that very spot. It is an attempt to touch the sacred, to find a place in the great story once more. So the echoes of the forbidden rituals have followed two parallel paths. One path led to our secular holidays. Samhain became the commercialized Halloween, a night of fun and candy, its spiritual heart almost entirely removed. The other path led to the modern pagan revival, a conscious and deliberate attempt to reconnect with that lost spiritual heart. Both paths, in their own very different ways, show the incredible resilience of these ancient ideas. They prove that you can burn the groves and outlaw the rituals, but you cannot completely extinguish a way of seeing the world that is so deeply tied to the land and the cycles of life and death. This brings us back to our journey. We have seen the ancient Celtic world, a place alive with spirits. We have witnessed the forbidden rituals of the sacred grove, ceremonies of life, death, and prophecy. We have followed the long, slow process of forgetting, as this world was suppressed, and its beliefs were transformed into folk customs and fairy tales. And we have seen how these fragments have survived into our modern world, as both secular holidays and new spiritual movements. We have followed the echoes through time, but we have not yet returned to the beginning. The promise we made at the start was to understand the silence of the ancient temples. We said the silence was not one of peace, but of a story intentionally erased. We have now told much of that erased story. But there is one final loop to close. We must now connect the grand, cosmic journey we have taken back to the simple, personal experience of our own lives today. Why does any of this matter to us now, in a world so different from that of the ancient Celts? What is the final meaning of these forbidden rituals? The answer lies in understanding what the rituals were ultimately for. Yes, they were for a good harvest, or for victory in battle. But beneath all of that, they served a deeper human need. They were a technology for creating meaning. They were a way of making a person feel that their small, individual life was part of a much larger, sacred story. To stand in the sacred grove was to know your place in the cosmos. You were standing on the earth, under the sky, with the world of the ancestors just a breath away. You were connected. We live in a world that has largely lost this feeling of connection. Our modern lives can often feel fragmented, isolated, and meaningless. We are told we are just a collection of atoms, living on a random rock in a universe that does not care about us. The world of the Celts offered the exact opposite message. It told you that the universe was a conscious, living being, and you were in a constant conversation with it. Every tree, every river, every star was a part of your family. This is the deep magic that we have lost. The persistence of Halloween, even in its commercial form, is a clue. On this one night of the year, our modern, rational world allows itself to play with the old ideas. We allow ourselves to think about ghosts, spirits, and the boundary between life and death. We dress up as monsters and heroes. For one night, we step outside our ordinary lives and dip our toes into the waters of myth and magic. It is a faint, playful echo, but it is an echo of a profound human need. The need to feel that there is more to the world than what we can see. The forbidden rituals were the tools the Celts used to navigate this larger, magical reality. But the rituals themselves are not the secret. The secret is the reality they were built to engage with. The deepest secret of the ancient temples is not a particular chant or sacrifice. It is the worldview that made them necessary. It is the simple but profound belief that the world is alive, that we are a part of it, and that our actions have a significance that echoes in other unseen realms. This is the core idea that was so powerful and so dangerous to the worlds that followed. Why was this worldview so dangerous? Because a world that is alive and sacred has to be treated with respect. You cannot simply exploit a forest for timber if it is the home of a god. You cannot pollute a river if it is a goddess. A worldview of enchantment places limits on human power and greed. The worlds that followed, based on a single, transcendent God who was separate from creation, or a scientific worldview that saw nature as a dead machine, removed those limits. It made the world a resource to be used, rather than a relative to be respected. So when we look at the ruins of an ancient temple, or a standing stone on a lonely hill, we are not just looking at a historical artifact. We are looking at a monument to a different way of being human. We are looking at a remnant of a world where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was porous, where the landscape was a story, and where human beings had a recognized place within that story. The silence of these places is the sound of that story being interrupted, of that connection being severed. And yet, the story is not truly over. The human hunger for that connection is too strong. We see it in the person who feels a sense of peace in a quiet forest. We see it in the popularity of fantasy stories, which recreate these worlds of myth and magic. And we see it in the simple, enduring joy of carving a pumpkin. These are all expressions of the same deep longing. We are all, in small ways, trying to find our way back to the sacred grove. We are looking for the doorway back into the enchanted world. The forbidden rituals themselves cannot be revived. Too much has been lost. The specific cultural context that gave them their power is gone forever. We cannot go back. But we can learn from them. We can learn to see the world not just as a collection of resources, but as a living system to which we belong. We can learn to listen again, to hear the stories the land is telling us. This is the ultimate lesson that the echoes of the ancient temples have carried down to us through the centuries. And this brings us finally to the end of our journey. We began with a promise. We stood before the silent stones of a ruined temple and promised to understand the forbidden rituals that were once performed there. We promised to uncover the story that had been so deliberately erased. We have traveled back in time. We have walked in the sacred grove, and we have followed the faint echoes of these ancient beliefs all the way into our own living rooms, where they hide in plain sight in our modern holidays. We now know that the rituals were a technology of connection, designed to maintain the delicate balance between the human world and a living, conscious universe. We know that they were declared forbidden because this worldview, this idea of an enchanted and sacred earth, was a direct threat to the new systems of power, both religious and secular, that came to dominate the Western world. To build the modern world, the old world had to be not just defeated, but actively forgotten. The magic had to be drained from the landscape. We saw how the most powerful expressions of this magic, the Festival of Samhain and the Cult of the Head, did not die. They were forced into hiding, transforming over centuries. The Night of Spirits became Halloween, the protective, sacred head became the carved turnip, and then the pumpkin. An act of deep, spiritual significance, a ritual to negotiate with the forces of life and death, slowly became a children's game. Its original purpose almost completely invisible, a ghost hiding behind a plastic mask. So when you see a jack-o'-lantern on a doorstep, you are not just seeing a vegetable, you are seeing the final destination of a 2,000-year journey. You are seeing the last faint echo of the Druid's sacred grove, of the Celtic warrior's belief in the soul's power, and of the profound, world-shaking idea that the veil between our world and another, more magical reality can sometimes grow thin. You are looking at the ghost of a forbidden ritual, a ritual that has been tamed, commercialized, and stripped of its power, yet somehow miraculously has survived. The silence of the ancient temples is not empty. It is filled with the memory of this lost world. It is a silence that asks us a question. It asks us if we have gained more than we have lost. We have gained science, technology, and a rational understanding of the universe. But we have lost the feeling of living inside a great and sacred story. The forbidden rituals of the ancient temples are a reminder of what that felt like. They are a whisper from our own deep past, reminding us of a connection we once had, and that a part of us, even now, is still searching for. This search for connection is written into the fabric of our modern lives in ways we rarely notice. We carry the ghosts of the sacred grove with us every day. When we knock on wood for good luck, we are unknowingly echoing a time when people believed that a friendly spirit lived inside the tree, and that touching its home could grant a blessing or ward off ill fortune. It is a tiny, unconscious ritual, a splinter of the old world of the living forest, lodged in our modern minds. We see it in our desire to have a garden, to put our hands in the soil. We feel it when we stand at the edge of the ocean and watch the waves, feeling a sense of awe and smallness. These are the moments when the veil thins for us. In these moments, we briefly step outside our busy, rational lives and touch something older, something that the ancient Celts knew intimately. We are feeling the faint residual sacredness of the earth, a power that no amount of concrete or steel has been able to completely pave over. The art and literature we create is saturated with these echoes. The entire genre of modern fantasy, with its elves, dwarves, and hidden magical worlds, is a direct descendant of Celtic mythology. It is a retelling of the stories of the otherworld and the Cete, repackaged for a new audience. When we read these books or watch these films, we are participating in a very old tradition. We are using stories to explore a reality that is more magical, more meaningful, and more alive than our own. We are satisfying a hunger for enchantment. Think of the archetype of the wise old mentor, the wizard who guides the young hero. This figure, from Merlin to Gandalf to Dumbledore, is the ghost of the druid. He is the keeper of the lost knowledge, the one who understands the secret patterns of the universe, the bridge between the ordinary world and the world of magic. The enduring power of this character shows how much we still long for the guidance that the Druids once provided. We long for someone to tell us that there is a deeper order to the chaos of the world. Even our modern psychology is beginning to rediscover these ancient ideas. The concept of a collective unconscious, a shared pool of ancestral memories and symbols, sounds very much like the Druidic belief in a spiritual realm that connected all living things. The growing understanding of the healing power of nature, of spending time in the wilderness to calm the mind, is a scientific rediscovery of what the shamans in the sacred grove knew all along. We are using new language to describe the same ancient truths about the human soul and its connection to the world. But there is a sadness in these echoes. They are fragmented and incomplete. Our connection to them is often unconscious. We knock on wood, but we have forgotten the spirit in the tree. We enjoy a fantasy story, but we see it as mere escapism, not as a memory of a lost reality. We have the pieces of the puzzle, but we have forgotten the picture on the box. The forbidden rituals were the instruction manual for how to assemble those pieces into a meaningful and coherent world. Without that manual, we are left with a collection of beautiful but disconnected fragments. This feeling of fragmentation is the great spiritual sickness of our time. We feel disconnected from nature, from our communities, from our ancestors, and often from our own deeper selves. The Celtic world was, above all else, a world of relationships. The purpose of life was to maintain your relationships with the tribe, with the ancestors, with the land, and with the gods. Everything was woven together. The forbidden rituals were the loom on which this fabric of connection was constantly being repaired and rewoven. They were the cure for the very sickness of disconnection that now afflicts us. Imagine, one last time, that you are a young person in that ancient Celtic village. You know exactly who you are, you know your family lineage stretching back generations, you know the stories of the gods of the land you live on, you know your duties to your community, you feel the presence of the other world all around you. Your life may be hard, and it may be short, but it is not meaningless. You are a vital thread in a vast, beautiful, and sacred tapestry. You are not alone. You are never alone. This is the heart of what was lost. We have traded this profound sense of belonging for a radical sense of individual freedom. We can be whoever we want to be, go wherever we want to go. But this freedom has come at a great cost. It has left us feeling like solitary atoms, adrift in a cold and empty universe. We have the freedom of a ship that has cut its anchor and is now drifting on an endless sea with no map and no destination. The forbidden rituals were the anchor that held the human soul fast to the bedrock of the cosmos. The story of the forbidden rituals is therefore not just a story about the past. It is a story about the present. It is a mirror that shows us what we have lost. It reminds us that there are other ways of being in the world. It suggests that the disenchantment of our world is not an inevitable fact, but the result of a series of historical choices. It whispers that what was forgotten can, perhaps in some new way, be remembered. The journey into the past becomes a search for a path into a different kind of future. This is not a call to abandon our modern world and return to the past. That is impossible. We cannot unlearn what we have learned. But we can integrate. We can take the wisdom of this ancient worldview and apply it to our own lives. We can choose to see the world as alive again. We can choose to walk through a forest not just as a hiker, but as a guest in a sacred place. We can choose to see our communities not just as collections of individuals, but as tribes that need our loyalty and care. We can create our own rituals. A ritual is simply an action performed with intention and awareness, designed to connect us to something larger than ourselves. It does not have to involve blood sacrifice or ancient gods. Tending a garden can be a ritual of connection to the earth. Sharing a meal with family, with all phones turned off, can be a ritual of community. Taking a quiet moment to watch the sunrise can be a ritual of connection to the cosmos. We can rebuild the loom, one thread at a time. The power of three, that central Celtic pattern, can still be our guide. It teaches us about cycles. It reminds us that every ending is also a beginning. Our current world, with its crises of climate change and social disconnection, can feel like it is in a dark phase, like the winter of Samhain. But the law of three promises that this is not the end of the story. It is a necessary phase of death that must come before a new rebirth. The world is always in a process of becoming. This ancient wisdom reminds us that we are not the masters of this process. We are participants. Like the warrior who prayed to the Morrigan, we do not control our fate, but we can face it with courage and honor. Like the farmer who left offerings for the spirits, we can act with respect and generosity towards the living world. And like the king who was married to the land, we can understand that our own well-being is inseparable from the well-being of the earth itself. These are not just mystical beliefs. They are a practical guide to survival. The story of the forbidden rituals teaches us that the most powerful magic is simply the magic of paying attention. The Druids were powerful because they paid attention to the movements of the stars, the properties of plants, and the deep patterns of the human soul. They saw the connections between all things because they looked for them. In our world of constant distraction, the simple act of paying attention has become a radical and transformative power. To pay attention is to make the world sacred again. So we return, at last, to the silent stones we began with. We have filled their silence with this long story. We have learned that they were not just places of worship, but centers of a worldview that saw the entire cosmos as a single, living, intelligent being. They were the places where humanity came to speak with the universe and to listen to its reply. They were the heart of a world that was woven together with magic, myth, and a profound sense of belonging. We now understand why the rituals performed there were forbidden. They were forbidden by the Romans because the Druids who led them were the heart of Celtic resistance. They were forbidden by the Christian Church because the belief in many nature spirits was a threat to the belief in one transcendent God. And they became forbidden to the modern world because the idea of a sacred conscious earth that cannot be endlessly exploited is a threat to a system built on endless growth and consumption. The worldview itself was the ultimate taboo. The silence of the temples, then, is the sound of that worldview being forcibly suppressed. It is the silence that falls after a great truth has been declared a lie. The rituals were erased, the groves were cut down, and the stories were twisted, all in an effort to make us forget. To make us forget that we are not separate from the world, but a part of it. To make us forget that the earth is not a dead thing, but our living mother. The silence was an act of forgetting, imposed from the outside. But we have also learned that this act of forgetting was not completely successful. The truth went into hiding. It hid in our holidays, in our fairy tales, in our language, and in our unconscious gestures. It broke into 1,000 pieces and scattered itself throughout our culture, waiting for us to find the pieces and put them back together again. The most forbidden knowledge could not be destroyed, only disguised. It has been waiting for us this whole time. And that brings us to the final and most personal part of our story. We have talked about history, about myths, about rituals, but the real subject has always been us, the viewer, the person listening to the story, because the same pattern that happened in the world also happens within each of us. We are all born with an innate sense of wonder and connection to the world, and for many of us, that sense is slowly educated out of us. We are taught to forget the magic. We are taught that the world is just a collection of objects, that a tree is just wood, and that a river is just water. We are taught that the other world is just a fantasy, and that the only reality is the one we can measure and control. We go through our own personal suppression of the enchanted worldview. We build a rational, adult self on top of the magical child we once were. We create our own inner silence, our own personal forgotten grove. But just like in the larger culture, the magic in us does not truly die. It goes into hiding. It speaks to us in our dreams. It calls to us in moments of awe and wonder. It whispers to us through art, music, and stories that move us for reasons we cannot quite explain. There is a part of every human being that still remembers the sacred grove, that still longs for the feeling of being part of a living, meaningful cosmos. Our own soul holds an echo of the forbidden world. The journey to understand the forbidden rituals of the ancient temples is, in the end, a journey to understand ourselves, It is an act of remembering. It is an invitation to find that forgotten grove within our own hearts, and to see if any of the ancient trees are still standing. It is a quest to find the key that was lost, the key that reopens the door to the enchanted world, not as a historical place, but as a state of being that is still available to us now. This is why these ancient stories have such power. They are not just about gods and heroes from long ago. They are maps. They are maps of the human soul. They show us the different parts of ourselves: the king, the warrior, the shaman, the connection to the land. They remind us that our inner world is as vast, as magical, and as full of powerful beings as the Celtic otherworld. The stories are a guide to our own inner landscape. So when we learn about the Morrigan, the triple goddess of fate, we are also learning about the cycles of creation and destruction in our own lives. When we learn about Lugh, the master of all skills, we are learning about our own potential for creativity and mastery. And when we learn about the sacred king's marriage to the land, we are learning about the necessity of integrating our own inner power with a sense of responsibility and connection to the world around us. The myths are a mirror for the soul. The ultimate forbidden ritual, then, is the ritual of looking in that mirror. It is the act of turning inward, of embarking on the shaman's journey into the wilderness of one's own consciousness. This is perhaps the most frightening journey of all. It means facing the parts of ourselves that are wild, untamed, and chaotic. It means confronting our own fears and our own deepest truths. This is the inner work that the ancient rituals were designed to support. This is what it truly means to hear the whispers of the past. It is not just about learning historical facts. It is about allowing those facts to resonate within us. It is about feeling the truth of these ancient ideas in our own experience. It is the moment when you stand in a forest and feel, not just think, that the trees are alive and aware. It is the moment when you look at the cycle of the seasons and see in it the great pattern of life, death, and rebirth that governs your own existence. In that moment, the past is no longer the past. It becomes a living presence. The Druid is no longer a historical figure. He is the voice of wisdom within you. The other world is no longer a mythical place. It is the vast, unexplored potential of your own inner life. The sacred grove is no longer a ruin. It is any place where you feel a deep and authentic connection to the mystery of being. The forbidden ritual is any action you take that deepens that connection. This is a power that no one can take from you. It does not require ancient temples or a priestly class. It requires only your attention, your intention, and your courage. It is the power to re-enchant your own world, to find the sacred hiding in the ordinary, to see the face of the divine not in a distant heaven, but in the earth beneath your feet and the people around you. This is the ultimate secret that was hidden within the forbidden rituals. It is the knowledge of how to make your own life a sacred ceremony. We have come a long way from a simple carved pumpkin. We have seen that this humble object is the end of a long thread that leads back through centuries of folklore, persecution, and forgetting, all the way to the heart of one of the most powerful spiritual traditions the world has ever known. It is a symbol of how even the most profound truths can be trivialized, but also of how they can, against all odds, survive. It is a symbol of a magic that has been forgotten, but not extinguished. So the next time you see the familiar symbols of Halloween, or hear a whisper of a fairy tale, perhaps you will see them differently. You will see them not as simple superstitions or childish fantasies, but as the scattered jewels of a lost crown. You will see them as the last messages from a world that was drowned, sealed in bottles, and sent floating down the river of time, waiting for a future generation to find them and understand their meaning. You will understand that the grinning face of the pumpkin is a guardian, a distant heir to the sacred head that once protected our ancestors. You will know that the costumed children going from door to door are a faint echo of the spirits of the dead returning on Samhain and of our ancient duty to honor them. And you will feel, perhaps, the slightest shiver of the old magic, the feeling of the veil between the worlds growing thin, just for one night. The journey we have taken is not just about understanding the past. It is about reclaiming it. It is about gathering these scattered fragments, these whispers and echoes, and seeing that they still form a coherent and powerful message. A message that is more relevant now than it has been for centuries. A message that tells us that we are not alone, that the world is not dead, and that we have a sacred duty to act as guardians, not masters, of this living, magical earth. This is the final fulfillment of the promise we made at the beginning. The forbidden rituals of the ancient temples were designed to weave the human world and the sacred world together into a single, seamless reality. The story of how they were suppressed and forgotten is the story of how that reality was torn apart. And the story of their faint but persistent echoes is the story of our enduring, unquenchable human need to weave that world back together again. This is the work of our time. To find new ways to perform this ancient task, to create new rituals of connection, new stories of belonging, and a new culture that is rooted in a reawakened sense of the sacred. The ancient Celts and their druid priests cannot teach us exactly how to do this. Their world is gone, but they can inspire us. They can remind us that such a world is possible. They stand as a testament to a way of being human that is rich with meaning, magic, and a deep, abiding love for the earth. And so we stand once more before the silent stones, but they are not silent anymore. We have learned to hear the story they are telling. We now know that their silence is not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows a great and terrible loss. It is the silence of a library that has been burned, of a song that has been interrupted. But we have found a few surviving pages of the book. We have learned the chorus of the song. The silence is no longer empty. It is pregnant with the story we have just told. The core concept of these temples was connection to a living world. The goal of the rituals was to maintain that connection. The promise they held was that a human life could be a meaningful part of a sacred cosmic drama. This was the beautiful and powerful idea that was deemed so dangerous it had to be forbidden. It was forbidden not because it was evil, but because it was a profound challenge to any system of thought that seeks to place humanity above and outside of the web of life. The rituals were the practical application of this worldview. They were the interface between the human and the divine. From the king's marriage to the land, ensuring social and natural harmony, to the shaman's journey into the wild, they were technologies of the soul. They were designed to keep the world in balance. Their loss was not just the loss of a religion, it was the loss of a vital set of tools for managing the relationship between humanity and the planet. We are living with the consequences of that loss today. And the human anchor, the fear and hope of the people who lived this reality, is the key to it all. For them, this was not a philosophy. It was life itself. The fear of a bad harvest was the fear of the land goddess's anger. The hope for victory was the hope for the Morrigan's favor. Their emotional lives were deeply intertwined with the living landscape. To feel this connection is to understand why the rituals were so important. They were not abstract symbols, they were the most important work in the world. Our journey has been a long one, from the sacred groves of the Druids to the suburban streets of modern Halloween. We have seen how a profound spiritual technology can be dismantled, forgotten, and transformed into a children's game. But we have also seen that nothing is ever truly lost. The most powerful ideas are like seeds. They can lie dormant in the soil for 1,000 years, but when the conditions are right, they can begin to grow again. The forbidden rituals were about honoring the great cycles, the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of the moon, and the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. This is the great wheel that turns and turns and turns. Cultures and religions may rise and fall, but the wheel keeps turning. The sun still rises at the winter solstice. The land still comes back to life in the spring. The core truths that the Celtic rituals were built upon are still the core truths of our existence. We live in an age that has tried to deny this wheel. We have tried to create a world of perpetual summer, of endless growth, a world without winter, without darkness, without death. But the wheel cannot be denied forever. The ancient Celts, with their deep understanding of Samhain, knew that the dark phase is necessary. It is the time of rest, of reflection, of letting go that must precede any new life. The forbidden rituals teach us to honor the darkness, not just to fear it. So the legacy of these rituals is a double one. It is a story of a great forgetting, of a world of magic that was lost. But it is also a story of incredible persistence, of a deep wisdom that has refused to die. It is a story that has been waiting patiently for us to be ready to hear it again. It whispers to us that the world is more mysterious, more beautiful, and more alive than we have been told. The final purpose of any great story is to change the way we see, to take something familiar and make it new. Our hope is that the next time you see a full moon, or walk in an old forest, or feel the turn of the seasons, you will feel a flicker of this ancient understanding. You will feel that you are not just an observer in a dead world, but a participant in a living, breathing mystery. You will remember, if only for a moment, what it feels like to live in an enchanted world. The greatest secret of the forbidden rituals is this: the temple was never just the grove of trees. The sacred space was never just the circle of stones. The rituals were a way of teaching people that the entire world is a temple. Every tree is a sacred pillar. Every river is a source of wisdom. Every living creature is a manifestation of the divine. The ultimate goal was not to go to a sacred place, but to learn to live your entire life in a sacred way. And so, the journey ends where it began, with the silent stones. But now we know that the silence is an invitation. It is an invitation to listen more deeply, to listen past the noise of our modern world, and to hear the faint, enduring song of the living earth. The story of the forbidden rituals is not just a history lesson. It is a key. It is a key to a door that has been closed but never locked. A door that leads back into a world of connection. That door is not in the past. It is not in some distant land. It is within us. The other world of the Celts is a perfect map for the undiscovered country of our own souls. The quest to understand them is the quest to understand ourselves, to find the courage of the warrior, the wisdom of the druid, and the deep connection of the king within our own hearts. The journey home is the journey inward. The world that gave birth to these rituals is gone. We cannot bring it back, but the need that created them is stronger than ever. The need to feel a part of something larger than ourselves. The need to live in a world that has meaning and purpose. The need for enchantment. The echoes of the forbidden rituals have survived, because this need is a fundamental part of what it means to be human. They have survived because we still need them. Think, finally, of that single candle burning inside a pumpkin on a dark night. It is a small light. It is a fragile light. It can be easily extinguished. But in the deep darkness, that small, fragile light is everything. It is a symbol of hope. It is a symbol of memory. It is the enduring light of a world of wonder, a tiny spark of the old magic that has somehow managed to travel all this way, through all this time, to shine for us, here, now, in our own modern darkness. The ancient groves are quiet. The chants of the druids have faded into the wind. But the world is still alive, and it is still speaking. The oldest stories are never truly over. They are simply waiting for a quiet moment, and for a heart that is willing to listen. The forbidden rituals are gone, but the sacred dance between humanity and the earth is not. It is our turn to learn the steps. It is our turn to join the dance.